Saying that, Boris Johnson lies is, like saying the sky is blue. It's a cold, hard fact. But also vice versa. If Boris Johnson told me the sky was blue, I'd probably have to look out the window just to check, just to make sure he was actually telling the truth. And this is the problem where we have a liar who is a prime minister. And unfortunately, we have lots of, again, many backbenchers who are quite willing to buy into that lie. That is why I've said, many of, the Tory politicians. Now, we've had some cases where some Tory politicians have jumped out and said he is lying, which is good. But unfortunately, in the cases of Brexit and Partygate, the vast majority of them do still support the fact that Boris Johnson is putting up these massive lies. We had an interesting case just last night on Question Time where she was saying, "Oh, Boris Johnson hasn't lied to Parliament," and the audience laughed at her. And yet, that's where we are. So there is still a lot of heat, of course, in these Partygate allegations. And I think we may very well see the public take out their frustrations on especially the Conservatives at the next May local elections. And remember, a lot of this heat is still going to carry over on to the next general election, which could be this year, could be next year, could be 2024. We really don't know, especially with their eyes firmly fixed on getting rid of that Fixed Term Parliament Act. But needless to say, Brexit, Partygate, the cost of living crisis, I keep on telling people things are going to get worse, a lot worse this year before they start to get better. But to get better, we actually have to have politicians who are prepared to tell the public the reality. Because you cannot govern a country if you are trying to engage in fanciful thinking. And that is ultimately really Boris Johnson and the current Conservative government and his governing, cabinet in a nutshell. So until we get rid of them, there ain't a chance of us sort of getting around to some serious, building to get ourselves out of this mess. So before we go jumping into the article today, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page, our donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do support the channel that way. So on with today's article. This comes from The Scotsman, or The Scootsman, depending. If you want to get me with my accent out. So, the title of the article is Boris Johnson's lies over Brexit, Partygate, and the rest are on collision course with hard reality. And we've been saying that for a while. When Brexit meets reality, reality always wins. And in case of lies about this, reality always wins. For many in the UK, the outstanding current example is, of course, the current Prime Minister. And he is still refusing to admit that the law was broken on his watch. And at number 10, on multiple occasions during the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021, despite the fact that the police finally doing to Boris Johnson's inner circle what they would have done to the rest of us on the spot months or even years ago. They have now issued at least 20 penalty notices or fines to people who attended the parties there. And at the time, the peculiarity, of course, in the first lockdown of 2020, so the same Prime Minister was warning us that we had to stay at home, work from home, educate our children at home, and only go out once a day for some brief exercise. We could really meet only one other person from a different household, provided we only had exercised outdoors together, and we did not stop to socialize. And of course, people everywhere were forbidden to visit elderly relatives in care homes, in the hospital, who were suffering alone and dying alone, and often being mourned by people who were alone. And for most of us at that time, the parties were any sort of just simply unthinkable. Yet, This is a very experience, a very real one, etched on millions of memories that Boris Johnson and those who continue to support him are now trying to efface with their blithe talk of just a few parties and the ever inaccurate claims that everyone broke the rules. No, we did not. And when it came to COVID, Boris Johnson, quote, got all the big decisions right. When in fact, from locking down far too late in 2020 to squandering billions on unusable equipment to presiding over the highest death toll in Western Europe, Boris Johnson's government got many of those big decisions tragically wrong. Lying in politics is, of course, nothing new, and fooling fooling most of the people most of the time has always been the name of the game for some politicians. And of course, no one denies, though, that the lying and, quote, the gaslighting of the imposition of these narratives that directly contradicts people's lived experience has now taken on a new intensity in the age of mass electronic communications and the internet. For years in the decade between 2010 and 2020, Western thinkers and pundits were preoccupied with the narrative shifting techniques allegedly developed by now Vladimir Putin and his close advisor Vladimir Surkov, and of course the impact they might have on turning on Western politics, for example, during Britain's EU referendum. And of course, during the Trump presidency, which obviously a concern which, in again Western minds, slightly overshadowed the almost unchallenged power of the present Russian regime to impose fabricated narratives on its own people. A very clear, at least 70%, who again, according to the polls, now fully accept the official account of Russia trying to, quote, save Ukraine from a government of Nazi drug addicts cynically bombing its own people. And of course, the question that remains for all of us living in this lying liars age is in power and what weapons we have against their false narratives. To begin with, it seems that we, the voters and citizens, have to become experts at not tarring all politicians with the same brush. Politicians do not exist, after all, who have never told a lie. Indeed, to present yourself in a positive light to the electorate, and as a democratic politician must, almost inevitably gloss over sins and errors to exaggerate their achievements. There is, of course, a difference, though, between politicians who tell half-truths to burnish their own political record and, of course, politicians who commit themselves to a whole-scale grand narrative that they know to be false. A difference between an everyday evasions of political debate and the chill of having to know your reality completely contradicts and denies what other COVID over time, over what COVID in the UK or in the war in Ukraine or even the threat to climate change. And of course, during these discussions, citizens who still need the help of a new generation of journalists, less welded to the now dysfunctional idea of impartiality between the competing political actors, instead directed to establishing facts and exposing the truth whether they may find it. It is also vital, I think, that we learn to call out the idea, very popular in some elite circles, that reality now barely exists and can always be bartered away with a new narrative line. Concepts to do with human rights and freedoms and even the rule of law and good governance must first be codified in a context of deeply flawed and imperialistic Western civilization. The ideas themselves, though, have a fundamental strength and virility that transcends history, and whether people are subject to burial suffering because of the actions of others, Ukraine, Yemen, Afghanistan, are among the most valuable, supposedly wealthy in the countries, those values resurface in the ancient cry for justice, compassion, human dignity, and freedom, and for the accountability of those in power. So try telling a woman whose toddler is starving to death in the ruins of Mariupol, or who's struggling to protect a Pacific island home from the ever-rising seawater, or who is sitting now in a cold house somewhere in Britain looking at the power bill that she can never pay. That reality no longer exists, and it can no longer bite. And as Bruce Burns wrote long ago, facts are chief that want a ding. And sooner or later, unless we can commit ourselves to once more to a politics of broadly based on truth and face up together to the facts that we know them and response that they demand, reality will always come for us in a way that narratives cannot disguise, from which no virtual alternative can even protect us anymore. And I completely 100% agree on that. You have a system of the Conservatives are fully prepared to lie. We've known that for some time. We've known that for a while. But again, I always say, when I say separate the Brexiteers from the Leave voters, I think you're right, entirely right to point out. Of course, there are politicians that are going to tell sort of half truths to make their record seem a bit more better. That's politics. But to lie wholesale, as we have seen from we are quote the leading country on so many things of COVID to Brexit's doing fine to all these things. You can't really take a sensible approach to trying solving these problems unless you actually are prepared to have a look at the reality of the situation and really tackle the root of these problems. Because the cost of living crisis ain't going to be tackled unless Sunak actually does something and really admits that the economy is really damaged. It's not this rising phoenix that certainly Boris Johnson and the rest of the Brexiteers were just saying just a few months ago. In fact, you'll notice they've now dropped almost that narrative completely, that oh, we're the fastest growing economy in the G7, but oh look, cost of living crisis. They've had to drop that narrative. You don't see the Conservative politicians now saying that. At least sort of for the past 2 weeks, we haven't seen Conservative politicians in any serious attempt try to say that, because very quickly, well, if we're sort of this really rising, fast rising economy, then why can't we go and raise taxes on the rich to pay for NHS or help like the poor during this fuel crisis that we're going to see? There's so many things that a government could be doing, or at least go back to the pandemic, that Rishi Sunak could have done during the pandemic to help out companies, businesses, and people, where you look what they did in Europe, and some countries are still doing, of course, in Europe. Rishi Sunak always said, oh, he's the most generous chancellor there is, giving all this stuff out. But when you really look at, again, other European countries, they were far more generous in their offerings to the people. And of course, the levelling up paper, the first 2 chapters, okay, amazing, acknowledging so many faults about the UK and there's no coherent industrial policy and also so much stuff. And then it goes into the 3rd chapter where it talks about allocating money. And in the first 2 chapters, it says, okay, this is how much money we need. And then in the 3rd chapter, you get the sticking plaster, the barely enough money. Because again, I've said this before, if you've ever had a project, and let's say, to keep it simple, you've been allocated like, I don't know, £1,000. That's how much to get this project done properly, that's how much you need. But then someone comes along and says, well, I'm cutting your budget to like 500. You cannot really deliver a good enough project, that there are going to be holes, there's going to be gaps, and you might now need in the future to maybe spend more money on that particular project just to make sure that it gets done right and correctly. Again, a lot of these projects, if they're not done rightly or correctly the first time, then you end up having to spend more money in the long run. And that is the classical Tory example of what we've seen before, and we're going to go over, I think, a piece later about how the economists are quite shocked that Rishi Sunak has offered nothing to the poorest in society to help them during this time. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a rotation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And there's, of course, my Patreon page down below as well. So, as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.